But tonight, we're talking about avoidant restrictive food intake disorder. That's ARFID, avoidant restrictive food intake disorder. And it's a disorder that is in the DSM-5. And I know a lot of you have a lot of questions about it. So where we're going to start is just by looking at the definition, because I know we have parents and professionals tuning in tonight. And personally, I think ARFID, just the definition, can be a little bit confusing, because what's the difference between ARFID and a pediatric feeding disorder? Well, ARFID isn't necessarily limited to pediatrics, for one thing. And it is only recently that it ended up in the DSM-5, meaning that a psychologist or a sociologist can make this diagnosis. Typically, when we talk about pediatric feeding disorders, a speech-language pathologist or an occupational therapist or even a pediatrician, of course, can make that diagnosis based on the signs and symptoms they see in the evaluation. But we cannot diagnose ARFID. That's strictly up to psychologists or sociologists, because again, it's in the DSM-5. So let's take a look at the definition. First of all, there's quite a number of pieces to this. The first one is that it's an eating or feeding disturbance, and that's hallmarked by either an apparent lack of interest in eating or food, avoidance based on sensory characteristics of food, and or concern about aversive consequences of eating, like I might choke or it might make me feel nauseous, etc. And it's manifested by a persistent failure to meet appropriate nutritional or energy needs associated, ready, with one or more of the following: significant weight loss or significant nutritional deficiency. Sounds a lot like a pediatric feeding disorder, right? That's because it is. The third thing you need to know is, in order to get the diagnosis of ARFID, remember, we're taking a look at one or more of the following. We've talked about significant weight loss, significant nutritional deficiency, but we also want to consider that these children may be dependent on enteral feeding or oral nutritional supplements. That could just be a kid shake that they drink all day long, right out of the milk box, or ones we typically think of are Pediasure, that kind of thing. It doesn't have to be a tube feeding, but of course it could be. The other characteristic would be that there is marked interference with psychosocial functioning. And what that means is, are they having trouble eating in the school cafeteria? Are they avoiding going over to friends' houses for sleepovers because they're nervous there isn't going to be food to eat? Are they hesitant to partake in class parties at school? Do they only want to go to one or two particular restaurants because they'll only order off those kid menus? Or will they only go to a particular restaurant because that's the only type of French fry they'll eat? All of that is influencing psychosocial functioning. Another piece of this is that the disturbance is not better explained by lack of available food, in other words, food insecurity, or by an associated culturally sanctioned practice. For example, perhaps in certain cultures, fasting may be a part of the family's food culture. Also, really important to note, the eating disturbance does not occur exclusively during the course of anorexia or bulimia. And there's no evidence of a disturbance in which one's body weight or shape is experienced. So in other words, in short, this has nothing to do with wanting to change body image, body shape, wanting to conform to a certain standard of thinness, etc. It has nothing to do with that. The eating disturbance is not attributable to a concurrent medical condition or better explained by another mental disorder. So, for example, perhaps the child also has social anxiety disorder. When the eating disturbance occurs in the context of another condition, the severity of the eating disturbance exceeds that routinely associated with a condition. So again, think about this for a second. If the child has, and they don't have to have this, I'm just giving this as an example, but if they have social anxiety disorder and they don't want to go to a slumber party because of social anxiety, and they also have difficulty eating in social situations, those are two totally different things. They're related, but two totally different disorders, just to give you an example. So remember, it really only has to be one or more of all of those characteristics that we just described. But the hallmarks are apparent lack of interest in eating or food, unless it's just their favorite foods, avoidance based on the sensory characteristics of food, and then finally, any sort of concern about aversive consequences of eating. And a lot of times we don't hear about those concerns because what the parents do, very well meaning, is they start to provide just what they know the child will eat because they're worried about their nutritional health. So when they're not being exposed to anything that they're concerned about, like if they're concerned about smell, or they're concerned about maybe choking, or they're concerned about gagging in front of other people, or throwing up in front of other people. If they are never exposed to food that creates that concern, we often don't know that's the cause of the disorder. So it really requires some good detective work. All right, so what are these 5 strategies? Well, especially for the parents listening out there, I really want you to know that this is not because you did anything wrong as a parent. And I just can't stress that enough, because being a mom myself, I know that I am constantly thinking about, what did I do wrong to create that behavior in my kids? What do I need to fix? It must have been something I did because I'm the mom, right? Well, it's not anything you did. It's not anything you did. But you are part of the process for getting better, and that's very empowering. As a matter of fact, recently, there was a wonderful study done at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, and they brought in 21 families. All the kids had the diagnosis of ARFID, and interestingly enough, about a third of them also had an anxiety disorder, which I think is interesting, right? But they brought in the families and they made sure that the kids met all the criteria. And then the kids didn't come anymore. Just the parents came. The parents came for 7 sessions, 90 minutes each. And they were essentially training the parents to be their own behavioral therapists. And by what I mean by that is just teaching them to parent these children a little bit differently. Because often when we have an extreme picky eater in our life, we just end up parenting them as a way we never intended to, because we're trying to keep the peace. And the main thing they focused on was exposure. Exposure is everything when it comes to learning to become an adventurous eater. So when these kids come to someone like me and the parents are looking for help, the 5 strategies that I start with are exposure, 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 exposure. I'm going to give you a little bit more detail, okay? All right. So exposure, as I said, is everything. And where we're going to start is exposure in the kitchen, at the grocery store, at the farmer's market. I'm sure all of you have heard me say this so many times. But families come to me and they've stopped providing those exposures because it creates more anxiety in the child. I think many of you have heard me say before that when we're talking about the anxious eater, one of the things that makes their anxiety grow is avoidance. So when we allow them to avoid going to the produce aisle or going into the dairy aisle, because I have one little kid who won't go in there because he can smell the milky smell. It's very subtle, but he can smell it, so he avoids it. Or a child who just won't go in the kitchen anymore. When we allow kids to do something that they're clearly capable of because we're trying to protect them, we call that the parent protection trap, we actually are making their anxiety worse. And that's what we always want to be thinking about, is not feeding the anxiety monster. So parents do this well-meaning because they really, they just quit exposing their kid. They quit offering food, first of all, that is new or might cause some distress. They quit taking them to places that might be new or cause distress or cause discomfort, et cetera, et cetera. And they do that to save money, to save face, frankly. Like, I don't want to give it to her again because she isn't going to eat it. And that's kind of embarrassing, especially in front of the relatives, to keep the peace, because the rest of the family starts to get stressed, and also just to keep their own anxiety low. So for all the parents listening and the professionals, I think we can really understand why parents do that, but our job is to help them to understand that exposure is everything. So that's why one of the first things we talk about is getting back in the kitchen. It's not about eating right now, even if it's just to help unload the groceries. Maybe getting back to gardening, maybe going to the grocery store or the farmer's market, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so that's number one, exposure. Number two is exposure on the plate. This is often the biggest stressor for the families who first start with me, because they're worried about the big reaction they're going to get because they haven't been putting new foods on their child's plate. As a matter of fact, research shows that parents only offer new foods on a plate 3 to 5 times, and then they just conclude naturally that, well, he doesn't like it, so I don't want to waste food, so I'm not going to give it to him anymore. But actually, one of the best strategies they can use is just about a tablespoon, not much at all, on the child's plate to keep up with that exposure. So whether they're going to start feeding therapy a month from now, or whether they're here for the first time, or they've been in therapy for 5 or 6 weeks, that's what we're working on, is being okay with new foods on our plate. The third type of exposure, after we're doing some basic getting in the kitchen, going to the grocery store, experiencing new foods on our plate, is beginning to experience small, underwhelming tastes. I mean, like the size of a pea. We're not really experiencing the food so much as we're experiencing the anxiety that we're going to feel when we go to take a tiny little taste. And I know that sounds surprising to many of you, but when kids have a lot of anxiety and they learn to avoidant restrictive food intake disorder, right? Avoidance. What happens is they're so scared of taking the next step that sometimes they just have to feel the fear and take the little taste to know, wow, they could really do it. It doesn't have to taste good. That's okay. No big deal. We're just practicing it. So that's where feeding therapy goes, as we start to work on the third type of exposure, which is small, underwhelming tastes about the size of a pea, and with a variety of foods, like as much variety as we possibly can. Because remember, it's not about the taste, it's about the tasting. It's about the verb. It's about actually taking up a little scoop and taking a little bite and going, I don't really like that yet, and being okay with that and being willing to try something new. And that's why variety in tasting is so important. Then finally, the fourth type of exposure is where we do begin to work a little bit more on volume. So in therapy, we start to work up to 1 tablespoon of new foods, tastes that are really big enough that their brain knows, oh, this is broccoli, right? And not just a little tiny bit that you instantly wash down with water. So now we've moved from tasting, the verb, to the actual taste and the texture and the temperature and the mouthfeel, and really getting used to that. And then finally, the fifth type of exposure is not stopping. In other words, expose, 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 even if you don't think it's going well. One of the things I talk about in my brand new 5-hour course called ARFID, The Anxious Eater. I'll be teaching that in the United States in 2020, and actually in Sydney and Melbourne, Australia as well. One of the things I'm really going to be stressing to the audience is that you'll often feel like all of a sudden it isn't going well. That's actually a good sign, because what that means is the kids are beginning to realize that they are getting better, and they're having a little trouble stepping out of their safe zone. So they might push back a tiny bit. Just model calm, let them know they're capable, gently, gently coach them through it, and don't back off at that point, because they need to get over that big hump of avoidance in order to have much more smooth sailing in the future. We call that an extinction burst in behavioral therapy. And that extinction burst is just where you think a behavior has begun to be extinguished, and then all of a sudden it's bigger and badder than ever. It's called an extinction burst. And it actually is a sign that things are about to get better. So make sure that you don't let that period worry you.